You're listening to the McBride Experience. I'm Jake, joined by my co-hosts Aaron and Jay, owners of McBride Custom Homes. We're taking you behind the scenes of custom homes, remodeling, cleaning, and property management in Northern Michigan. Let's get started. All right, well, today we're diving into one of the most complex and rewarding types of projects, and that's waterfront homes. So again, I'm here with Jay and Aaron, and we're going to break down everything from the EGLE permitting to design solutions that protect the environment while still delivering those killer lake views that our clients dream about. So Jay, I'll start with you first. Let's do a little quick reality check. When someone calls McBride Custom Homes about building on the water, what's the first thing you need them to understand?
Well, they're not just buying the house on the water or the lot on the water with the view. They're actually going into a lot of regulatory process throughout that. Most non-waterfront homes, there's very little process to that. And that can dramatically affect where and what you could build.
Right. So Aaron, from your experience, then what draws clients to waterfront construction and what usually surprises them most about the process?
Well, definitely the views, having an opportunity to enjoy the water, sunsets, that sort of thing. So that's a big draw. But usually the biggest surprise is how much attention needs to be given to the land, especially if there's wetland implications or other sort of ecological implications. Those need to really be planned out well in advance.
So, and we're going to talk about this in some depth throughout the episode, but I also want to maybe just quickly talk about why is waterfront construction so different than building anywhere else? Because everywhere's got processes and regulations. There's building codes. What makes waterfront, whether it's lake or stream or river or wetlands, what makes that so different than building anywhere else? Jay?
Well, you're dealing with sometimes even federal agencies that protect these waterways. We live by the Great Lakes. So those are federally regulated lakes. And so sometimes you get into those zoning meetings, you have not only state, federal, but also local. Can be townships have different regulations on what you can do. So, it's a broad spectrum that you have to deal with versus non-lakefront.
Okay. Anything to add for that, Aaron?
And just you're dealing with conditions that are a lot more sensitive. And you also really need to plan like long-term impact. So with ecological things, it may seem to be okay for the present, but really understanding how that project will implicate the environment long-term. So that's where some of that really needs good planning.
Yeah, I guess you're right. A field's not going to change its borders, but waterways change all the time. They're moving. So that makes a lot of sense. All right, well, let's get into some regulatory landscape deep dive talk. Let's talk about EGLE. That's EGLE, commonly called EGLE. But for our listeners who've never heard of them, Jay, can you break down what it is and why they have so much influence over waterfront projects?
Well, it stands for Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. So they're regulating what goes on in that environment. So they're the gatekeeper, you could say, for a waterfront development in Michigan. So they protect the environment, which means they control what you can disturb and where you can build and how you manage runoff and erosion. So those are very key components when you're building on a lakefront that you have to do from the very start of the project.
No, and we're going to probably say lakefront, and we focus most on lakefront because that's most of the properties we do. But this also applies to other bodies of water, right?
Correct. Yep. Like there's critical dune areas that even are quite a ways off the water that you might not know. So you have to check where your region is and make sure you're not into those areas.
Okay. So what are the main regulations that affect waterfront construction in Michigan? Do you know any acts or key acts or rules that are really good to know about? And again, the caveat is these change. So you always want to check with your local ordinance or, make sure it's current. But what are we looking at currently?
I would say there's setbacks off the water. They can be 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet, just depends on what area and regulations. But it's not a one size fits all, right? So some areas require more, some areas require less. It just depends if there's an existing structure, if that can be built onto. There might be a grandfathered section into that. or if it's just a brand new property that's never been touched, there's going to be different regulations on that.
Yeah, and something to note too is sometimes, the EGLE may say this is what we're dealing with, or this is what we want. But it's not to say that there's not room for conversation to be had, because sometimes visions don't align. EGLE's saying this, but the client might have this vision of what they want to see here. And so with some education, with some, deep dive into options and, what are some possibilities, oftentimes you can plan alternatives and things that might help both parties to achieve what they're looking for.
Well, and I think that's a really good point because EGLE as an organization isn't designed to help you think of other ways you can do the thing you want to do. They're just simply they're being presented with an idea and they have the obligation to know if this is going to be good for the environment. So it does kind of rest on the builder to explore those other options, like you said, to work within the constraints, but provide alternative solutions. So I think that's a key point to not just look at that as they said yes or they said no. What else can we do? That's a really great point. How are the setbacks actually measured? Is there some standard? If it's a water's edge, bluff edge, is it where the sand meets the grass? I mean, is it where the water? How does that work?
Well, again, like I mentioned earlier, it just depends on what site you're on, what the regulations are. If it's a critical dune area, it's going to have different regulations than just a lakefront. So those things play into different ways they measure, different constraints from that. Distance from critical dune is going to be different than a distance from a lake edge. So it just really does come down to where you're building and how you're building it.
And even what part of the house you're talking about. Patios, decks have sometimes different setbacks than the actual foundation of the home. So that too can be, very useful information as you're planning and designing for that space.
Yeah, because indoor outdoor space is a big draw. So that's nice that you brought that out. So then with waterfront clients, when you're kind of walking that lot, Aaron, what are some visual things that you might throw up some flags and go, this is not a problem, but an area that we want to focus on, or at least check out? What are some of those visual things you see?
To let us know whether or not wetlands are going to be an issue.
Yeah, exactly.
The soil you're walking, usually you're going to test the soil too, part of that, but you can also get a good idea just from looking at it. Are we dealing with wetlands? You can tell by what's growing there often as to, okay, there's definitely something at play here. We usually do our research prior to going to a lot. You can go on the Emmett County site or whichever county, and you can start doing a little bit of research about that particular soil and whether or not there's a good idea of what you're dealing with there. So we can get a good idea even before we get out there. But those sorts of things, the marshiness, how even by stepping on the soil, you can tell how much moisture it's containing.
Right. And you're not talking about like after a heavy rain or something. This is just the state of the land as it sits might have more water. Are there any factors that determine how strict a setback has to be? Like, let's say waterfront, is it the same? You mentioned different setbacks before, but is that the same for like a certain township or a certain region, or does that still vary?
That definitely varies by township. There's different regulations. You go from one lake, you get all that down, and then the next lake has a total different township regulation. How far you can build, how high you can build, where you can put drain fields and runoffs, and how you've got to do that. There's so many different variables per township that you have to deal with. And, it depends on how wet that land is too. Like he was saying, when you step on it, but there's plant life that they look at. Certain plant life only grows in certain type of environments, right? So they come out and they evaluate that stuff, and that'll tell you different setbacks if it's a really, really wet area.
Yeah.
So all those things matter.
Okay.
Even when you're utilizing space that's grandfathered in, certain townships and communities will have different rules even within that boundary. So you can grandfather it in, yes, and then there's different percentages. Maybe you have to leave the existing foundation, so forth. There's a lot of parameters, a lot of different variances depending on where you're building.
Well, thank you for that. So then you mentioned this earlier. One of you mentioned this earlier about critical dune area. How does that designation change the game when it comes to building?
Well, you have to get EGLE involved when you're in a critical dune area, and they will lay out a process to either build in that area if you can, or the regulations they're going to set in that area for you to be able to do that. And we've had several sites that have been in critical dune designated areas that they've come out and inspected. We don't want this to be like, oh my goodness, you're in a critical dune area, you're never going to be able to do this. This should be a positive experience, and it can be if you take the right steps with these regulatory things. They're for the best for the environment. If you go in looking at it that way, it's going to have the best outcome. If you go in with a negative attitude, like, oh goodness, I've got to go to EGLE and we got to go through permitting, that's going to be the experience.
And sometimes with critical dunes, that's not always super easy to identify. And so this is sometimes, tricky thing is, you're working with somebody, they're excited to begin, break ground, and they just want to go. But when you're in a situation like this, it's so critical that you do your due diligence up front so that there's not any violations later on in the project or any sort of delays, that sort of thing that kind of surface. Those things are not fun. So do your due diligence out of the gates.
Well, and I like, Jay, that you also mentioned that the whole purpose of this is to protect the environment. And we think about, that's the reason people come and get homes up here. That's the reason you build up here, is how beautiful it is. So if these requirements weren't there, it would look like maybe a much busier metropolitan area. Those views would be gone, the beautiful trees that would provide that nice shade in the summer, or damage to the water, the pristine water that we love up here. So I'm glad you guys both brought that out. So let's look into the reality of the permitting process. What kind of timeline are we looking at, Jay? If I buy a waterfront lot today, can you even give me a date when I'm moving in?
We like to say between 12 and 18 months for most homes. Obviously, the scale of the home changes that, but it can be up to several months just in the permitting process on these type of homes. So if you're all in on that, it could be a few years of really the time you start planning to the end game.
Okay.
Hopefully it changes, but right now, even EGLE's, like many businesses, a little short staffed, and there's a lot to do. So they cover a large area. And so they're very, very busy. So it's not likely that if you call them, they'll be there ready to answer your questions and get you to that next phase, in just a couple hours. It takes a little bit of time to go through the process.
And that's great for setting expectations for a build too, and why it's so important to do a lot of this research, maybe even before you purchase the property. Sometimes it's, maybe it's family property, but if you're looking to purchase, going ahead and doing that is probably really helpful. The actual application process, documentation, studies, that kind of thing, how complicated is that?
It can be pretty in-depth, really, especially when you're dealing with EGLE. It's, there's a lot of paperwork that goes into it, and they do a study. They sometimes are out on site 1, 2, 3 times, and then you're going back and forth on maybe what you can do and how you can mitigate the risk there for the environment. And then you got the local levels too, that takes a little extra steps. You can go through a planning board, so you have to, they only meet, I think it's once a month on that type of stuff. So you have to hit on their timelines. So it can be a pretty arduous process, but since we do it all the time, it does mitigate that a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. And they want to be helpful. They want to give you good recommendations, but they also expect you to do your homework. So they want to see what your plan is. They're expecting you to say, all right, this is our intention for this area. This is how we're planning on preserving, the environment around us, and especially what we're dealing with. And so they want to see site plans. They want to see, ecological assessments, maybe some other alternatives to minimize the impact and so forth. So that's something that they're going to ask of you to have ready for them.
Good. Well, and I was going to ask, about the cost for things like this, but I'm going to skip that because it's just going to be it depends answer. But I think the key takeaway for this is just that you should budget not just your financially, but also your time and your expectation when it comes to this, because to preserve the beauty it does require a little bit of effort. Aaron, so you've been through this process with clients many times. Is there a situation that comes to mind where the permitting process taught you or your client about something, something unexpected or something that kind of came up that was really helpful to learn, or any story you have around that?
There's, I mean, they're all different. They're all unique. But it's the biggest thing is pumping the brakes. I think, we get so excited to begin the build and get construction underway, but just really emphasizing the value of planning the lot. Whether or not we need terraced landscaping, it's a slope site. How we're going to use the grounds, how we're going to mitigate runoff. There's with excavation, there's all kinds of things that surface. All that's got to be planned so that there's not fill or whatever going into the wetlands. Those things need to be carefully planned, and so there's a lot that just it's just switching the focus. Like, let's deal with this first, and then we can get excited about the build.
Okay. Any interesting things happen that you can think of, Jay?
Yeah, I mean, just when you sometimes think you've seen it all, you haven't. We've had a property where we would have never guessed it was in a critical dune area, and lo and behold, we go through the permitting process, and it is. But it's, what do you do there? Right?
Mm-hmm.
You're ready to start. The homeowners are ready to start, and then you've got to come back to them and say, well, there's a little more process to this, and it's going to take a little more time. So just handling that, navigating those waters, but just making sure they know the importance of this too when we run into things, helps them get over that initial, oh goodness, it's going to take a few more months, to go through that process.
Yeah. Well, and I think because that's the last thing a homeowner wants to hear, is that this is going to take longer, because it already is a lengthy process, but the focus on doing it right, and you'll really get a good outcome. What happens when EGLE says no? Let's just say they come back and they say, nope, you can't build in the way that you've said you're going to build. Have you had to deliver that news to a client? What does that look like?
Well, I have dealt with that. But having a good relationship with EGLE goes a long way.
Okay.
Also, them appreciating that we're also interested in the welfare of the environment, minimizing the impact. And so what we've done in the past is just had an on-site meeting to go over things, start kind of analyzing strategies, alternatives. What's their reason behind that? What are they concerned about? So oftentimes there's really good reasons, but with some good planning, getting, like, for example, we've got Watershed Council, a great organization that we've used a lot, that they have helped provide some alternatives, some strategizing, some things. Hey, this is a great concern they have. I see why they said that, but here's something that could get you beyond that roadblock. And so those sorts, again, it just keep hitting on the planning. Planning is so critical, but it gets you beyond those things so that you're not halfway through a construction of a house and now you're getting flagged and red taped, and that's where a position you don't want to be in.
Thank you for sharing that. Anything else to add, Jay?
Yeah, I mean, viewing EGLE as a partner, not as somebody that's out to get you.
Yeah,
it's more of a relationship, and the more you view it that way, the more they're going to work with you to get to the destination we both want.
Yeah,
but in a way that doesn't impact the environment adversely.
Good. Well, thank you both for kind of talking about all of that around the permitting process and some of the ins and outs of that. I want to switch gears and now start looking at designing solutions and some creative problem solving when it comes to this. So we've talked about some of the constraints. Let's look for some ways now that we can, still get those water views. So, Aaron, if you're constrained by this major setback, do you have a go-to strategy for if your client still wants water views?
One of the biggest things is walking that lot. Just spending a little bit of time getting their vision, even how they want the house designed, whether it's 2-story or if they want to go up or out, what their focus is, and then taking a little bit and saying, okay, what are we working with? How to optimize this view. And so sometimes you can do elevated decks, you can do cantilevered patios, glass railing can help with views, figuring out where sunsets, and sunrises are located, and what angle you need to be at with the house to properly get the most of that. It's sad when you see a house, that's not designed well for optimizing that. So we really like to, in a design phase, make sure we're considering all those different things so that when we're in this phase, we've optimized it for what they're hoping to achieve, and that they can enjoy all the natural beauty that's there.
I love that. Um, it might seem obvious, but when does it make sense to build up rather than out? Because there are variations in land, like you just mentioned, and it's not a one size fits all, obviously. But when does it make sense to build up rather than out?
Well, your building envelope, if it's a tight site, a lot of lakefront, it's narrow lots.
Yeah.
Usually they're long and narrow. So that creates you having to get some design challenges solved with. Most people still want first floor master suite, right? As they age in place.
Yep.
They want that, not climbing stairs. So how do we get that with all their main living area in a small constrained build? And then what's up? Usually it's views. We try to get a maximized views. We did a house with a rooftop deck,
Yeah.
for entertainment space. So you have to get creative at times, and when is that necessary? It all really depends on the homeowner and what they want in the house and how they want it to function. Is when we decide, well, to get this, we're either going to have to go up or lengthen the house down the lot. And so those are things that, like you said, you walk it, you talk it, and then you design it.
Good. And really that conversation that helps you understand who's going to live there, what they want out of the property. Because maybe lake views are important, but maybe that really big family space is more important. So awesome. From a structural standpoint, what foundation solutions work best for these challenging waterfront sites? Because I know you can't always go down depending on the water table. A lot of people love having their basement with a rec room and that kind of thing. So what might be an option?
Well, that is a good question. Sometimes you have to go up, because of that. Depends on where the water table's at, where the marshland is, and so you might have to do a lot of ground prep, making sure that you're maximizing the amount of drainage surrounding the house, so that you're not running into issues. And so that might be a different way that you really build the house up, but you're doing it in a way that's improving its drainage, so that you're remediating the moisture from around your foundation. So you might do on something like that. We just did that. We had a lot of extra drainage that we brought in, 2 foot of drainage. And so it enabled all of that moisture to kind of get away from the structure to protect it. And then go up from there.
Okay. Anything to add, Jay?
Yeah. It used to be the old saying in Michigan was, it wasn't if you were going to have a wet basement, it was when, right? And that was in large part due to water getting in around the building, not having gutters and not designing the home to shed the water properly, or going too deep in the soil when there is a high water table there. And maybe it isn't when you build, but we've noticed, a few years back, we set records for high water tables. And then, you got a foot of water in your crawl space or basement. Those are things that we never want to happen. So we plan getting that water away from the building right out of the gates. It's very important to us to never have that call where we have water coming into our basement that we love and we finished, and
Right.
it's a big part of their home.
Right. Well, and thank you for saying that too about the change, because you're also, these homes are going to be around for generations, and it does change over time. So really thinking that big picture and not just what's going to work for this year or what it was like last year is not an indication of what it's going to be next year. So it's nice to know that you're putting that level of detail into the conversation. Aaron, I think you mentioned cantilevers, overhangs. How can you legally expand that living experience toward the water without, with maximizing those views in that space, but also still respecting the environment?
Well, it's working around the restrictions, right?
Yeah.
So, as I mentioned earlier, the patio may have a different setback than the actual footprint or the foundation of the home. So if the concern is the footprint, you can then cantilever your decks, for example, and so forth. You can bring the footprint of the home as close to the water or the setback limitation and then work from there. But that gives you an opportunity to get a little bit closer. And so you optimize it in that way so that you're just getting the most of your opportunity there.
Good. Well, then I think this is more of an opinion question and maybe where trends are going. It used to be houses had these big picture windows, and that was like the main living room area. You wanted that beautiful outside view from the couch. But what are the trends now? Like, what's actually happening? Are people still wanting that big picture window lake view, or are they looking at other parts of the home that they really want to have those views?
Yeah, that's again, it's per homeowner, right? But most of them want the lake views in the living room areas, their master suites, and actually all the bedrooms.
Oh,
Now
okay.
that's a thing. So a lot of the guests when they come up, they get to stay in an area now that they get lake views. Back when we were building in the 90s and stuff, that wasn't really a thing. It
Right.
was how many bedrooms can we get in these homes because it's a
Yeah.
lake home, everybody's going to want to come up, but they never thought about them having a view. Well, now it's full on suites with a view, so they have
Yeah.
their space and the functionality of the family stays and they have their privacy, but they also have those beautiful lake views.
Yeah, we're really finding too that technology is starting to find its way into this things like smart windows, for example. Because if you're facing a sunset, as the sun's coming down, that glare can be intense. Depending on if that's your situation, you have
Hmm.
all these big window wall, that spans your whole living room, dining room area, and then as the sun comes down, the sun can be quite intense. And so using technology to help with that situation, it can change it from clear to opaque. There's all sorts of different things. So okay, now you're minimizing. And so technology has been a really useful thing as far as maintaining that, but also helping with the nuances of it.
Yeah, that's good. And just speaking from experience as a guest, I prefer a guest room with a lake view. I mean, just me personally. Um, so outdoor spaces, I feel like we kind of talked about some, how to leverage the outdoor spaces. Are there any constraints with like landscaping? I mean, is that still required, landscaping to beautify? Do you still have to, deal with the setbacks there too?
You do. There's differences in landscaping, whether it's a hardscape or not. So they take all that into consideration. So you have to give them a plan,
Hmm.
right, that shows what your plan is to do with landscaping. And if it's in an area where they don't want, foreign vegetation
Mm,
introduced to the area, they won't allow that.
right.
So you have to work within those constraints on. So it's basically again talking with them, getting what they are requiring, and developing a nice plan to go with that.
Yeah, sometimes there's some wetlands, that separate the shoreline or the
Yeah.
water and the house. So sometimes you've got boardwalks or something like that you're trying to, to help with get how do we get them to the water now?
Right.
Right. So there's different things like that. There's, if you are building up, for example, you probably have to have some sort of terraced situation to keep the wetlands protected from
Right.
runoff and things just going into there. So you have to plan that a little bit. What sort of materials are going to be good for that area that's not going to impact them, and so there's a little bit of a planning in that regard. Decks or docks, floating docks sometimes,
Oh,
depending
sure.
on that situation, is a good thing. Coir logs, live staking. There's bunch of different things that can kind of help with that.
Good. Man, a lot of detail goes into this. So thank you for kind of, again, getting into the weeds on some of that. One final thing I would like to know about this. So we talked about landscaping, but stormwater management, native landscaping. I know the state loves if you can put native things back in. But what about maybe any other final? We talk about these creative solutions. Any other final comments on approach to the design and creativity when it comes to building around these requirements? Anything else you'd like to share?
I think the main thing is really getting all parties involved and have that conversation of how can we have this successful? What is it going to take, for each party involved to have their part in it and design that plan that's going to work, because there's a lot of different steps and a lot of different people involved throughout that. So getting on the same page with all those organizations is key.
Okay. Good.
It's good advice.
Good advice. Take that to the bank. That's another McBride experience with Jake, Aaron, and Jay. Subscribe, share with friends, and send us your construction questions. This is where every home has a story and every story matters. Until next time.